Hi there, welcome to the Master Carcosa channel once again. We're going to do some Shakespeare today, probably for quite a while. Not a while, but for longer than normal. And I'm going to ask you to bring up, there's going to be some work involved in this, which is where everything's going to go off the rails. Right, we're gonna use a case study because what I'm going to focus on is what I talked about, two things that I talked about actually in the top 5 ways to improve your Shakespeare video, which are establishing meaning and avoiding paraphrasing. Because what you might be thinking, and what you might have thought at the time, was, well, how do I know what I'm saying if I'm not allowed to think in modern contemporary English when I'm talking? Well, that's what we're going to do today, and we're going to do it with a really hard piece of Shakespearean text. Now, a few of my ex-students will have come across us using this before. Some of the ex-students will even have maybe done this play with me before, but most of you won't have. So what I would like you to do is bring up, not on the Spark Notes, preferably on the shakespeare.mit.edu site, the first scene, Act 1 of Henry IV, Part 1. So get Henry IV, Part 1, first scene, and I'm going to look at the first speech from that, because as you will see, it's a monster, both in terms of its length, although there were much longer speeches in Shakespeare, indeed in Henry IV, Part 1, but it's also a monster in terms of the difficulty of establishing meaning. Now, those of you who are going to do that, and I recommend you do, please pause this video now and bring that up so that you're now looking at this in two-sided, or you can just listen to my voice whilst looking at the speech. For those who aren't doing that, I will read the whole thing in full now. So the whole speech is the king. It's King Henry IV. So shaken as we are, so one with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant, and breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar remote. No more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. No more shall trenching war channel her fields, nor blues her flowerets with the armoured hoofs of hostile paces, those opposed eyes, which, like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery, shall now in mutual well-beseeming ranks march all one way, and be no more opposed against acquaintance, kindred, and allies. The edge of war, like an ill-sheathed knife, no more shall cut his master. Therefore, friends, as far as to the sepulchre of Christ, whose soldier now, under whose blessed cross we are impressed and engaged to fight, forthwith a power of English shall we levy, to whose arms were moulded in their mother's womb to chase these pagans in their holy fields, over whose acres walked those blessed feet which 1400 years ago were nailed to our advantage on the bitter cross. But this our purpose now is 12 months old, and bootless 'tis to tell you we will go. Therefore we meet not now. Then let me hear of you, my gentle cousin Westmoreland, what yesternight our council did decree in forwarding this dear expedience. Now, loose plot-wise, which we'll cover first, is Henry talking to a bunch of his lords about the plan that he has in place. Now, as he acknowledges at the end of this speech, he's already told them this plan before. So what this really is a prologue, is a proxy prologue for the play. Audiences may or may not have watched Richard II, which chronologically goes immediately before this play, and knows that King Henry IV took his crown basically by force, killed Richard II. Those who enjoy their Game of Thrones, it is absolutely the equivalent of Robert's Rebellion that we find ourselves in at the beginning of Henry IV, Part 1, with Henry IV as Robert Baratheon, or the usurper character, having killed a mad king, and now taken the throne, and unlike Robert Baratheon, is rather concerned about it, worried about the future, and not necessarily regret, but certainly a certain amount of concern for his soul. Now, that's just a very bare bones discussion. So what we're going to do is look at this one thing at a time. As you probably could tell when I was reading it, it's a tough one. It's a tough one for anyone, and don't be ashamed to admit that it's a tough one. Now, the main trick that we'll be using here is clause simplification, which is to take each meaningful clause, or each sentence in most cases, it's not always a sentence, and just identify the simplest possible version of that clause. And you want to think of the simplest version of that clause as the spine, the main road, if you will, of that idea, of that thought. And then you're going to build up the trimmings around that thought with the more, maybe it's the more difficult stuff. It's really important when you're identifying meaning in Shakespeare to identify your main clause. So let's do it with these first 4 lines, which is the first sentence. So shaken as we are, so won with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant, and breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar remote. Now, most simplest versions of clauses go subject, verb, object. So what's the subject of this clause? So shaken as we are, so won with care. All of that is a prefix. All of that is before he gets to what he's going to say. So for now, when we're establishing our simplest clause, we can get rid of that. We'll bring it back, but we can get rid of it for now. Find we a time for frighted peace to pant and breathe. Right, so there's an and here. That means there are actually 2 clauses going on, so we can just focus on probably the main one, and he's about to start on the main one, so the verb of our simplified clause is going to be breathe. Find we a time for frighted peace to pant and breathe short-winded accents of new broils. So we can get rid of all of our adjectives and just get to the object. And breathe short-winded accent. Okay, so accents is our object. So the simplest version of this 4-line clause is actually we breathe accents. Now, we is the royal we. It's King Henry talking about himself. It's essentially I, but I strongly recommend you to never think about it as I, because he's saying we, and the king is we. That's what the king refers to themselves as. So we breathe accents. Don't think of it as just talk, which is a translation. Think of it more in terms of what that language evokes. Breathe, you know what the word breathe means. We breathe accents. What are accents? Accents are phrases, utterings, meaningful utterings, utterings that can be interpreted. So whilst we breathe accents, you might be tempted to think, I talk is the basic framework of this. Try not to think about it as I am speaking or I talk. Think of it as we breathe accents. That's what you're saying. On the most base possible level, we breathe accents. So why are you breathing accents? Okay, well what type of accents are you breathing? Well, that is answered. We breathe accents of broils. Broils, what does that mean? Okay, so broiling is an American cooking term now, and that might be useful for you. Think about cooking or boiling or putting something in an oven. It means excitable things, or probably fighting. But again, don't think of it just of, I will talk about fighting. We breathe accents of broils. Because the word fighting existed in Shakespeare's time, the word wars existed in Shakespeare's time, and he doesn't use the word fighting or wars, he uses the word broils. So charge that with the meaning that it has, bearing in mind the imagery that, for him, it conveys, which does involve fighting and wars and creating hotspots. Maybe that's what you want to think about. We breathe accents of broils. What kind of broils? We've got a simple adjective there, new. We breathe accents of new broils. How do you do it? We breathe short-winded accents of broils. So I'm not going to talk for very long. Of course, he does talk for quite a while, which is our first character note. We breathe short-winded. Not short accents, short-winded accents. And that gives you a bit of a clue to a physical life, maybe. Don't ignore any of it. Find things out from all of it. Okay, so now we've built up a bit of meaning. We breathe short-winded accents of new broils. What kind of new broils? That question is also answered. We breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar remote. We can get rid of, it depends on what you want to do, strands afar. To be commenced afar. We breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced afar. If you want to simplify it down to that, if you're happy to go accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar remote. And you can't just put both of those words in. If Shakespeare wanted it to be commenced in strands afar or commenced in strands afar, commenced in strands remote, he would have written that. He didn't. He writes to be commenced in strands afar remote. Doubling down on the mystery of how far away this place that the broils are going to happen in is. So let's have a look at that other part of the pre-clause, if you like, the and. What goes before the and? We find a time to pant. You can even simplify it to we pant. Think of the physical manifestation of panting. A dog who's exhausted pants. A person who's exhausted. So he's implying that he and the country is exhausted. So me and the country are exhausted and we are going to be allowed to pant, to rest. Why does he need to rest? Because he is, the first line says, he's shaken and won with care. Won is maybe a word that you need to directly look up. It means faded, it means pale, it means worn, is probably what you'll find. And then the moment you identify that that's the immediate translation of that word, just return to one, and that's all you ever think about. You just use the word one. I know what the word one means now. I don't need to mentally or literally translate it to pale. So we're shaken, we're won with care, and we find a time to pant. In fact, we're not finding a panting for us. We're allowing peace to pant. What kind of peace? Frighted peace. Peace that has been frightened or frighted. Peace has been broken, but we're going to allow peace to rest. Allow the country that's been in civil turmoil to rest. And that's how we get to this full phrase that can be simplified to, we breathe accents. So shaken as we are, so won with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant and breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar, remote. Okay, so that's our first clause. So we then have a series of quite simple clauses. Our next clause is no more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. Let's simplify this. So the soil shall no daub her lips. So this soil shall no more daub her lips is essentially the simplest version of this clause. This soil, obviously, is not an agent, so you need to bring the soil to life. You need to animate the soil in your voice. The soil daubing her lips. What kind of lips? The lips that are daubed with her own children's blood. So the soil is giving birth to children, and the children are bleeding, and the soil is daubing its lips with the children's blood. So this is a way of talking about civil war in a very visceral and yet poetic way. It's poetic because of the language that's being used. This could be put a lot more bluntly, but at the same time it's talking about the children of the land literally bleeding into the land. Now, the other bit that we've not talked about is the thirsty entrance, which is a very active thing to say of the soil. So no more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. No more shall trenching war channel her fields. No more shall war channel fields. Whose fields? Her fields. What kind of war? Trenching war. No more shall trenching war channel her fields, nor bruise her flowerets with the armoured hooves of hostile paces. So if you're struggling with that, no more her flowerets with the... So what are flowerets? Exactly what it sounds like. It means flower beds. So just think of flower beds instead of flowerets and just call it flowerets. The armoured hoofs. Obviously that's a literal indication of armed horses, but it's not. It's the things that are armed are, inverted commas, hostile paces. Hostile acts, but he doesn't say hostile acts, he says hostile paces, thus conjuring the image of an army marching. An army marching with armoured hooves. So there's a pile, an absolute load of cross imagery. We've got wartime imagery, we've got England as a garden, we've got England as having soil that's giving birth and then is drinking blood. You need to get all of these things in, and without isolating everything like this, you're not going to pick up on everything. So nor bruise her flowerets, again, clear sort of physical imagery, nor bruise her flowerets with the armed hooves of hostile paces. And then we have, and I'll probably, because of the length, make this the last one. This is the hardest clause, probably one of the hardest clauses in Shakespeare. So we'll just isolate what this clause is. Those opposed eyes, which like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery, shall now in mutual well-beseeming ranks march all one way, and be no more opposed against acquaintance, kindred, and allies. That's a monster. It's a monster right there of a clause. Let's see if we can find subject, verb, object, or at least as close to that as we can make it. The main road of this really hard sentence. Those opposed eyes. Right, so we seem to have a subject, eyes. Those eyes. So then we just carry on, which, like the meteors, well, that's simile. So like, we don't need anything that starts with like. All of one nature, we're still in like. We're still in like of all one substance bred. Did lately meet in the intestine shock. Well, that was still the like, and describing the eyes. So we're still on what kind of eyes they are. Now, for now, we can ignore that. Shall now. Okay. So we're about to say, in mutual well-beseeming ranks. Now we run into imagery again. So we don't need to worry about this. This is still describing how... We're no longer describing what the eyes were. We're now describing what the eyes are going to be. We don't need to worry about that for now. Shall now... shall now in mutual well-beseeming ranks march all one way and be no more opposed. Okay, so we've got an and, so we only need one of those things. So those eyes shall now be no more opposed. And then we can probably put the word opposed, because that's how we've gone from the start of this clause to the end of this clause. Those opposed eyes shall now be no more opposed. So we're talking about England like a body with two eyes, and they're opposed. They're against each other. So those opposed eyes shall be no more opposed. Now we can expand this a little bit by adding the bit of and. Those opposed eyes shall now march all one way and be no more opposed. That's still a simple clause. That's still a simple sentence that you can probably understand. Those opposed eyes shall now march all one way and be no more opposed. But now we need way more information about how the eyes were and how the eyes are going to be now. So let's focus on the first bit of this. What were the eyes like? Why do the eyes need to be changed? Those opposite eyes, which, like the... Okay, so now we've set up a which, but then we go into a different simile. So we can drop that subclause, kind of a sub-subclause, and move to the next bit. Which did lately meet in civil butchery. Those opposite eyes which did lately meet in civil butchery. You can even get rid of the civil because that's an adjective. Which did lately meet in butchery. Shall now march all one way and be no more opposed. So let's put all that together. We can probably figure this out. We can probably understand it. Those opposite eyes which did lately meet in civil butchery shall now march all one way and be no more opposed. Okay, so that we can build up some meaning. But that's not enough. There's still more. So now let's start all... Let's add a bit of the how things are going to be now. So they'll now march all one way and be no more opposed. But they're not... How are they going to march? They're going to march in mutual, well-beseeming ranks. And if this sounds like he's kind of doubling and trebling down on saying the same thing about how everything's going to be, well, he is, and that should be a character note. And the huge amount of repetition that's going on in this speech should give you clear character notes for how broken Henry is by what's happened, and by how adamant he is that this is not going to happen again. It shows how strong his objective is about ending civil war forever in England, which is, so it's going to happen. So now we've built up to those opposite eyes, which did lately meet in civil butchery, shall now, in mutual well-beseeming ranks, march all one way and be no more opposed. But there's more. But there is more. Because he describes those eyes... He doesn't just think of them as a body, he thinks of them as though they are planets and stars, which again gives you an indication of how strongly he feels about all this. Those opposite eyes are like the meteors of a troubled heaven. And then he goes on to explain some more, but that's an additional clause on top of this. So let's just bring it out into this and see how we've built up. So that the meteors of a troubled heaven are how we're describing the opposite eyes as they are now. Those opposite eyes, which, like the meteors of a troubled heaven, did lately meet in civil butchery, shall now in mutual well-beseeming ranks march all one way and be no more opposed. But there's more. Okay, so let's now focus on the type of civil butchery. Now, civil butchery is already in itself a very visceral, gutting, right in the guts description. And speaking of guts, we've got the intestine shock and furious close. So we've moved from the heavens to describe how those eyes start out fighting and they end up having, rummaging in each other's guts and cutting each other's intestines out. So let's build this up now. We as we understand it, those opposite eyes, which, like the meteors of a troubled heaven, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery, shall now in mutual well-beseeming ranks march all one way, and be no more opposed. Okay? So, there's more, still. Because he goes on to describe the meteors of a troubled heaven. And again, this should be like a big sign. This is how strongly he feels about this. This is how upset he is about the meteors of a troubled heaven, the eyes, the civil war, the civil factions fighting against each other, and how much he talks about them ultimately being family, because they're all of one nature, and they're all of one substance bred. They've all been bred out of one substance. They are all the same, which is the soil. They are fruits of the land of England, which is ironic because he has a go at pagans later in the speech. But such as it is. Okay, so now we have one more phase to add to this clause. Those opposed eyes which, like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery, shall now in mutual, well-beseeming ranks march all one way and be no more opposed. And then there's one last bit, which is, in what way shall there be no more opposed? Well, he doesn't actually say anything new. Again, we've got this repetition, because he says no more opposed against acquaintance, no more opposed against kindred, and no more opposed against allies. All of which essentially mean the same thing. And so what you're doing is you're building up a sense of, via this tautology, via this repeating of himself in different words, again, an indication of how strongly and how emotional he feels about all this. Now, does this mean that you play it emotionally? Not necessarily, because he is a king and he's very, very wordy. So you might decide eventually that this is about how much he's containing himself, despite how strongly he feels about this. Those opposed eyes, which, like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery, shall now in mutual, well-beseeming ranks march all one way, and be no more opposed against acquaintance, kindred, and allies. Another interpretation. Okay, so we can put all of that together, all those different clauses, and from the main road, and bear in mind, ultimately the main road of what we've got to so far is, we find a time for peace to pant, we breathe accents of new broils. The soil shall no more daub her lips with blood. Trenching wars no more shall channel her fields. Those eyes shall now march all one way and be no more opposed. That's the main road, that's the spine. In fact, his spine's a little bit simpler even than that. And then we build that up to owning the meaning of the whole phrase, no paraphrasing. So shaken as we are, so won with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant, and breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar, remote. No more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. No more shall trenching war channel her fields, nor bruise her flowerets with the armed hooves of hostile paces. Those opposed eyes, which like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery, shall now, in mutual, well-beseeming ranks, march all one way and be no more opposed against acquaintance, kindred, and allies. And there are infinite ways and varieties to do that, but that's the main. Communicating meaning is the main point there. You can enjoy or not enjoy the tone of my acting, the scale of the acting, and we'll talk about managing thoughts, but that's working to sort of, and you want to work yourself up so that you have to do it at least 75% energy in order to convey that meaning. Otherwise, you'll be autopiloting through imagery that you are not giving any credit to or importance to or attachment to. Now, we might come back to this. We might have a look at a couple of other examples in time. I hope that's of use. Bye now.